So you wanted to know what a peace deal in Ukraine, orchestrated by Donald Trump, might actually mean for Europe and the world.
Yeah.
So we dove into this fascinating analysis by Marco Casario. He's a financial expert who's really tuned in to how global events shake things up, not just in the markets, but in our everyday lives too.
Yeah, it's fascinating, how Casario connects the dots between all the geopolitical maneuvering and the potential economic shifts, that could impact us all.
Right.
I mean, we're not just talking about some abstract political theory. We're talking about real world effects, on investments, energy prices, and even what we see in the grocery store.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the big question here.
Okay.
Why is Trump so determined to end this war? It seems like a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Well, you have to remember that Trump really operates from that America First perspective. And just to be clear for our listener, that means prioritizing American interests above all else, including reducing foreign involvement in aid.
Right.
A good portion of his voter base feels like the U.S. has been shouldering too much of the burden in these international conflicts, and they'd rather see those resources focused domestically.
So it's not just Trump being Trump. There's a whole voter sentiment fueling this.
Exactly.
But what's the strategic play here?
Well, Casario highlights some key arguments from this America First Policy Institute document.
Okay.
They argue that the current situation in Ukraine is essentially a stalemate, making, a decisive Ukrainian victory pretty unlikely. And they say the longer this drags on, the more it strengthens alliances between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
Oh, wow.
Which is a scenario that, could pose a serious challenge to U.S. global influence.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Those countries, they represent significant economic and military power. And a united front like that could undermine U.S. interests in various regions, from trade to security.
Okay, a strengthened alliance like that is definitely something to avoid, and the U.S. needs to consider that carefully.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, there's also the issue of the U.S.'s own ammunition supply.
Okay.
The analysis suggests that the U.S. could potentially, deplete its arsenal.
Really?
In a matter of weeks if a conflict with China were to erupt.
Wow.
So that vulnerability adds another layer of urgency to finding a resolution in Ukraine.
Okay, wow. A potential conflict with China.
Yeah.
Is a whole other can of worms.
Right.
So it seems like Trump has multiple motivations for pushing for peace. But Casario argues that getting Russia on board might be a lot trickier than it sounds.
Right. Yeah. If we look at the bigger picture here, Russia's history, it's marked by this need for a security buffer.
Okay.
Because of their vulnerable geography, vast plains with very few natural barriers. They view, NATO expansion as a direct threat encroaching on that buffer zone.
Okay.
So for Russia, territorial gains in Ukraine aren't just about land, they're about establishing a strategic defense perimeter.
So even if Russia gets to keep some of the territory they've taken,
right,
they might still not feel secure enough to agree to a peace deal.
Exactly. And there's another, crucial factor, Casario points out.
Okay.
The Russian economy, it's heavily dependent on war production and oil exports, especially to China.
Right.
So ending the war, could actually disrupt that whole system, potentially destabilizing Putin's regime and weakening his grip on power.
That's a really interesting point. So for Putin, ending the war might actually be riskier than continuing it. It's like a complex web of motivations here.
Yeah.
I'm already starting to see how difficult it will be to find a solution that works for everyone.
It is a complex web, and you're picking up on that quickly. And just when you think it couldn't get any more tangled, Casario throws Taiwan into the mix.
Oh, yes, Taiwan.
Yeah.
I was wondering where that fit into all of this.
But you got to remember that China has been increasingly vocal about its ambitions regarding Taiwan,
right,
which produces the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors. I mean, these tiny chips are essential for everything, from smartphones to military equipment. And China sees control over Taiwan as key to their technological dominance.
Right.
Now, if the U.S. were to be, perceived as backing down or losing in Ukraine, it could really embolden China to make a move on Taiwan.
So Trump isn't just thinking about Ukraine in isolation.
Right.
He's playing 3D chess with the entire global power structure.
Right, exactly.
A high-stakes game with incredibly high consequences.
Yeah.
Okay, so with all that in mind, what's the actual plan?
Yeah.
How does he intend to make peace happen?
So according to Trump's deputy, the plan revolves around two main pillars. The first, a ceasefire would be established along the current front lines, creating like a demilitarized zone, similar to what we see between North and South Korea. And second, Ukraine would have to declare neutrality, meaning, giving up on its aspirations to join NATO.
So essentially, Ukraine would have to make some major concessions in exchange for peace.
Yes, and to increase the pressure. Sure. Trump has suggested he might threaten to reduce or even completely cut off U.S. military aid to Ukraine, which has already been substantial.
Wow.
This is the leverage he believes will bring all parties to the table.
Wow. Talk about a high-pressure negotiation. So much hinges on whether Putin would even consider these terms. And let's be honest, he might demand even more concessions. And what if he just flat out refuses?
Those are all valid concerns, and it's, far from a sure thing. There are a lot of what ifs and potential pitfalls. But Casario highlights what he calls Trump's ace in the hole. A potentially even more powerful tool than cutting off aid.
Okay, this is where things get interesting. Tell me more about this ace in the hole.
So he calls it the oil weapon. The U.S. could drastically increase its own oil production, driving global prices down to around $50 a barrel.
Wow.
You see, Russia's economy is heavily reliant on oil revenue. And this kind of price drop could cripple their budget and potentially destabilize Putin's regime.
So basically, an economic price war? That's a bold move.
Yes.
That could have major ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely.
We'd be looking at potential disruptions in energy markets, shifts in global alliances, and who knows what else. It's a risky gamble with potentially huge consequences.
It is a gamble, but one that, Trump seems willing to take. He believes this is the leverage he needs to, force Putin to the negotiating table and dictate the terms of a peace agreement. But the question remains, will it work? And what will the ultimate cost be? Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but, for the whole world.
All of this is fascinating on a geopolitical level. But, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. What does this potential peace deal, this oil weapon and everything else we've discussed, what does it all mean for Europe and, more importantly, for our listeners' wallet?
That's the key question, isn't it? And Casario paints a picture with both risks and opportunities. A ceasefire, or even better, a lasting peace agreement could lead to more stable markets. We might see a decrease in volatility, which is generally, good news for investors.
So after all the turmoil and uncertainty, there's a chance for things to calm down and become more predictable.
That's one possible scenario. And think about energy prices. If the, geopolitical pressure on European energy supplies eases, gas and oil prices, they could go down. Now, that's good news for consumers who are, struggling with high energy bills. But it could be bad news for, energy companies that have been profiting from the current situation.
It's fascinating how even within, broad categories like consumers and energy companies, there will be winners and losers depending on how things play out.
Absolutely.
What about other potential impacts?
Well, Casario also points out that a peaceful resolution could actually accelerate the transition to renewable energy sources and green infrastructure in Europe. The crisis has really highlighted the vulnerability of relying on fossil fuels, from a single potentially hostile supplier like Russia. So a peace deal could be the push Europe needs to invest heavily in renewables and achieve greater energy independence.
That's an interesting silver lining. A forced push towards more sustainable energy solutions.
And let's not forget about the potential impact on food prices. Ukraine is a major supplier of grain and seed oil. So a resolution to the conflict could help stabilize those costs, benefiting consumers at the grocery store and also having a positive impact on the agricultural sector.
So there's a chance we could see cheaper groceries, potentially lower energy bills, and a more stable market overall. Not bad.
Not bad.
But I have a feeling there are some downsides to consider as well, right?
Oh, of course.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Right. You're absolutely right. Think about what's happened to the price of gold and other safe haven assets since the war began.
Okay.
They've surged in value because investors, flock to them during times of uncertainty.
Right.
But if a peace deal is reached and, markets stabilize, they could lose some of their value.
So those who invested in gold as a hedge against risk might see their returns diminish.
Potentially, it all comes down to understanding how these markets react to geopolitical shifts. Another interesting point Casario raises is that if the conflict ends, and military spending decreases, the euro could actually strengthen.
That sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah, it depends. Stronger euro.
It depends on your perspective,
Yeah.
A stronger euro could be beneficial for European consumers who are buying imported goods.
Right.
But it could also impact those who, invested in assets like gold or cryptocurrencies as a way to protect themselves against a weakening euro.
Right.
Those investments might lose some of their value.
So it's all about understanding the potential ripple effects.
Exactly.
Both positive and negative.
Yeah.
It's clear that this peace plan, if it comes to fruition, will have a massive impact on Europe.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of the world?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And one that we'll delve into more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear more about that. So we've established that, the potential ramifications of this peace plan are vast, impacting everything from global power dynamics to the price of bread in Europe.
Yeah.
But as you think about all this, what really struck you about Casario's assessment?
Honestly, it was at that point about Europe needing to become more self-reliant.
Yeah.
It's this situation, regardless of how it unfolds, is a major wake-up call for the EU.
What's fascinating here is this isn't a new concept.
No.
The shift away from a U.S.-centric world order, it's been brewing for quite some time.
Yeah.
Remember, back in 2016 when Trump warned Germany about, relying too heavily on Russian gas, he was already highlighting the need for Europe to diversify its energy sources and reduce its dependence on a potential adversary.
Oh, right. Yeah, he was sounding the alarm back then. So this is more of a long-term trend that's being accelerated by the current situation.
Exactly, yeah. The 2008 economic crisis, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
All of these events have chipped away at the perception of the U.S. as the world's unwavering leader, always there to step in and solve problems.
Right.
Now with Trump back in the White House, and his America First policy, front and center, it's becoming even more apparent that Europe can't just assume the U.S. will always be there to bail them out.
Okay, so let's say Europe does decide to take Casario's advice and embrace a more autonomous role on the world stage.
Okay.
What would that actually look like in practice?
Well, for starters, it would mean significantly bolstering, their military capabilities. We're talking about increased defense spending across the board, which, as we mentioned earlier, could have its own set of economic consequences, potentially leading to higher national debts.
Right.
And even a weaker euro in the short term.
Right. There are always trade-offs.
Yeah.
But isn't there also a potential upside here? If Europe becomes less reliant on U.S. military support, wouldn't that also make them less vulnerable to, U.S. political whims?
Yeah.
I mean, remember Trump's whole, NATO members need to pay their fair share campaign?
Totally.
It seems like he was, ready to shake things up and withdraw support if he felt allies weren't contributing enough.
That's a really insightful observation. You're hitting on a key point.
Yeah.
Greater autonomy for Europe could mean more freedom to act in their own best interests without being, beholden to the U.S. or feeling pressured to align with policies that don't serve them.
Right.
It could also lead to stronger alliances within Europe itself, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose as they, navigate a more multipolar world.
So maybe it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
There's a chance for Europe to emerge from this situation, stronger and more self-assured.
Exactly.
With a clearer vision of its role in the world.
Precisely. It's an opportunity for the EU to, redefine its place on the global stage and assert itself as a major player in its own right, shaping the future rather than just reacting to events dictated by others. But of course, there will be challenges and, pushback along the way.
Okay, so we've covered the potential political and economic implications for Europe as a whole, But Casorio also dives into the potential effects on, specific sectors.
Right.
What jumped out at you there?
Well, the energy sector is obviously like front and center.
Yep.
As we discussed, lower gas and oil prices would likely be, a boon for consumers struggling with high energy costs.
Right.
But it could significantly hurt, traditional energy companies that have been reaping huge profits from the current situation.
The potential shift in fortunes within the energy sector.
Yeah.
With some players losing out while others stand to gain.
Exactly. And it's not just about, winners and losers. It's about a fundamental shift in the energy landscape.
Right.
This crisis has exposed the vulnerability of relying on fossil fuels from a single, potentially hostile supplier like Russia.
Yeah.
This could be the push Europe needs to finally, break free from that dependence.
Yeah.
And accelerate the transition to renewable energy sources.
Yeah.
We're talking about a potential, boom for companies involved in solar, wind, geothermal, and other clean technologies.
So maybe a win for the environment in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, a good investment for the planet, but potentially for our listeners' portfolio as well.
It's certainly something to consider.
Yeah.
Of course, there are always risks associated with any investment.
Right.
But the potential for growth in the renewable energy sector is, undeniable, especially in light of the current geopolitical situation.
What about the agricultural sector?
Yeah.
We talked about the potential for stabilized food prices.
Mm-hmm.
But are there other ripple effects to think about?
Yeah, Casorio points out that a reduction in, the cost of fertilizers, which are heavily reliant on natural gas,
right,
could be a significant benefit for farmers in Europe.
Yeah.
This could lead to increased agricultural production and potentially higher profits, creating a more stable and secure food supply for the region.
So a potential win-win for both farmers and consumers.
Exactly.
Lower input costs for farmers and more affordable food for everyone else.
Exactly. And let's not forget about, the logistics industry.
Oh, right.
A resolution to the conflict would mean fewer disruptions to global supply chains.
Okay.
Making it, easier and less expensive to transport goods.
Yeah.
That translates to lower shipping costs.
Right.
And ultimately, lower prices for consumers.
That's a welcome thought for anyone who's been feeling the pinch of inflation lately.
Yeah.
More efficient logistics mean lower prices across the board.
Right.
Which could help ease some of that,